right, we're back for We Hate Money bonus episode. This is bonus episode 2. It's going to be a quickie. We're just going to continue the discussion because we just had some interesting points about TLT and TLTW. King, if you wouldn't mind, could you please reiterate what you were saying about TLT for the We Hate Money listeners? Because that was an interesting conversation, which I think they should be made aware of. General in nature.
So yeah, TLTW is they're one of the many dividend covered call ETFs. Um, they do. I believe that they actually buy TLT. Don't quote me on that. They might just do the naked calls on it, but I think that they actually do buy it and then sell covered calls on it. But the nature of it is that as TLT drops and it continues to drop at its very unfortunate rate that it's been dropping, the dividend yield goes up. And so right now it's actually an extremely attractive dividend yield. Not necessarily a bad time to buy in if you think that there is a bottom in sight for TLT eventually. And to that point, at some point in time, TLT has to stop dropping because as TLT continues to go down, unrealized losses on balance sheets of banks, central banks that hold a lot of 20-year, 10-year, 30-year assets, treasury assets, they are going to get forced to write those down because at some point in time, a bank will get to the point where they need some of that money, and every time they sell even just a little bit of it, they have to write down the value that has been lost. And when that happens, it causes bank failures, as we saw earlier in the year. And when bank failures happen, suddenly the long end of the curve starts to drop. And because central banks have to react to that, or some kind of a stimulus has to be included in that, or just from the nature of the fact that banks fail and then they are consumed by larger banks and whatnot. And then, so there's kind of almost like a bouncing point for TLT that we're getting really, really close to anyways. So that was just saying that, TLTW is one of my favorites right now for just kind of loading up in my retirement account for dividends.
Thanks for that recap, mate. That is interesting tidbit there. I'm also going to put that on my watch list. I've actually seen people bandying that one about, not TLTW, but TLT in particular, as like an interesting long. Yeah. Wiz, off the back of that conversation, you had some interesting points about where you thought rates were going to go and where you think cuts were going to occur.
Well, I'm not an expert, so keep that in mind. But I feel that we're going to probably see cuts. In a, I guess, more ideal world where things maybe make sense at the end of 2024 for either good or bad reasons. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. But I don't know if that's necessarily going to be good for yields because the Fed fund rates are not pushing up, any higher that we can see for now. So yields moving up on the long end of the curve. I don't know if that really makes sense or not. As far as debt financing goes for the US, I think we said it does, but I think once the curve starts to steepen, if we're not really aggressively cutting, then the shorter end of the curves should be pinned around 5%, as far as I can tell. So if we're going to steepen, that means the long end of the curve has to go up from the 5% point. That really doesn't sound like a good bullish case for TLT.
Yeah, it's two sides of the same coin. I think, and then off the back of that, we were discussing like when they'll cut rates and how that will affect both the bond market and the stock market. I think King mentioned off air, but also what he said last week is that if rates were to be cut, it's probably going to be in response to a crisis. Obviously, the Fed has signaled for a long while that they want to try and hold rates where they are for as long a period as possible without breaking anything so they can drain liquidity. And I believe that to be the case. Like, I don't think they're lying when they say that. But if something goes pear-shaped and they absolutely have to cut rates, like a banking crisis, that's going to happen. And will that be good for anyone at the time? No, like especially not equities. So interesting spot we find ourselves in, but that's sort of what, in a sense, that's what we are all waiting for. Position appropriately and wait for that event to occur.
Just to reiterate on something from before. So TLT, the 20-year, when you look at the yield for the 20-year, the rates for the 20-year, what you're essentially in the most basic forms you're saying is that this is what you think the average of the interest rates, the short-term interest rates, are going to be over the next 20 years. So you want to get paid based on what you think it's going to be averaged out over 20 years. If you think that 5% is going to be the average over the next 20 years, where is the United States as a nation in 20 years? Where's the dollar going to be in 20 years? Because we have a spending problem that's not going to get fixed soon without a lot of pain. If we fix that spending problem, GDP just tanks. So if you were to say that we're going to balance our budget, you either need to have economic boom time to get us to the point where we can take in as much money as we're spending, or you need to have an austerity that brings us down to a level where we're not spending. The federal government pumps so much money into our economy and into the world economy. If you were to do that, it would most likely be through austerity, just judging by political wins. If you have that austerity, there is no chance in hell you're going to have an average of 5% interest rates over the next 20 years, because the central bank is going to have to drop interest rates to spur economic growth to keep us from going into a depression. So that's kind of the thought process behind TLT is, you, in the current deficit spending that we have, you cannot have a 5% interest rate for very long before things break. In that case, 5% looks really, really good, because I've heard people say the Goldilocks scenario is getting us down to like 2.5 or 3% long-term interest rates, which would be amazing if that was the case. Then you're making all of that extra premium on that yield that you bought today. See what I'm saying? So it's an interesting conundrum, because you have to think of it as not today, but where do you think the average over 20 years is going to be?
Well, 20 years is like, no one knows. Like the Fed can't
Exactly.
even predict 6 months from now. So, what chance do we have? I'm being a little sarcastic there. But
But think about the last time that it was this high. Think about the people that bought in, what was it, 2007? Think about the people that bought bonds at 4.5%, 5%, and then
they
we
were
ended up
right.
with 15 years of 0% interest, or close to 0% interest rates, and those people just sat back and laughed because we didn't have inflation, and they got all that yield at their time while they sat on a mortgage of 3% and cars at 0% and everything else.
Yeah, but the one thing is that the asset values have jumped dramatically because of those 0% rates. I mean, the thing is that it's unsustainable to keep prices continuing to move up as they are, and we're squeezing people out of earning a living. And this is why people talk about, sort of universal basic income, is because they think there's this way to backdoor yeah, the crisis, the, what is it? I can't even say it now. Um, Cost of living crisis. Thank you. And you can't just keep printing money and taking money from other people to give to other people to live off of. It just is going to roll this proverbial can of bad policy and fiscal policy to me, which is continuously having a inflationary period that's been just protracted. We keep just protracting it. And I just don't think that that's the way we're going to fix we're going into an area where our population growth isn't going to stagnate too. We have to keep that in mind. And people just
Well,
look at
I mean, we're
growth
we're
and
11
they,
years behind Japan. Like, look at what's happening to Japan because we're
yeah,
our age, our demographics are about 11 years behind Japan. We've talked about that before too.
yeah. So
I
if we
think
want to talk about like 10, 20 years in the future, we also have to start looking at the demographics of population as well. And we have to look at the mistake we've made by saying we have to achieve 2% more or less every year. And we didn't for a while. We do have to talk about that because I think we only had like 1% ish for quite some time.
I mean, this is
Um,
why, like, the reason everything you guys are talking about is why the market's so hyped about AI and robotics. Because if there's a convenient way to grow GDP around the world, but in particular in the United States, in the face of all these issues, then that is a way out as well. So, yeah, the
well, I mean,
productivity
yeah.
the productivity throughputs that you might see over a 20-year time period, if you believe some of the pundits that say, this AI moment is akin to the internet, or will be bigger than the internet in terms of what that did for productivity. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that's where the optimism side of it comes through.
And I don't see anything wrong with looking at it that way. I mean, I'm not against it at all. I'm just, to me, there's this thing that's cheaper than AI, and you don't have to program it really.
Which
It's
is
Are you
what,
talking
called,
about India again,
it's
or
called, yeah, it's called, the developing world
brother,
is an,
that isn't cheaper than
see,
AI
but
because AI,
we're doing the exact opposite of that right now. The United States is currently experiencing one of the hugest onshoring efforts, which is hugely inflationary. Like, you're bringing costs up because you're bringing things back into the U.S. to be made, um, and that's great for workers. It's not quite as great for a central banker who's trying to figure out how to increase supply and
well, they're so
decrease
afraid of,
demand.
deflation, right? And
Well,
I mean, for some good reason there too, but it having some deflation to correct prices just a little bit is not a bad thing in itself.
yeah, well, inflation and deflation it's about who's going to be the winner. Like, we've talked about
Well,
that before too. Like, if you have assets, you don't want them going down in price. You want them going up in price. But if you need assets, of course you want them going down in price. So who gets to be the winner? But
I
yeah,
think the winner has been the 1%
I
of,
think you
but
boys mean
but
I think you boys mean disinflation as opposed to deflation.
no,
no,
I mean
because
hardcore deflation
yeah, we're talking hardcore
because
deflation because there are some parts of our economy that are actually experiencing deflation, not just prices aren't going up as fast; they are actually going down.
Well, I mean, deflation anywhere is probably not something that you want to see because obviously, if you sort of
Yeah.
flow through the outcome of deflation, it means that no one's going to spend on that. Like in the previous episode's Tesla example, where if you know the price is going to come down 20% next year, you're going to hold off spending. It just becomes a vicious cycle. So,
But deflation helps you if you need to spend credit right now to buy something right now. Deflation does help you out specifically. That's why I'm saying you pick winners and losers when you talk about deflation and inflation. Like, the people that benefited the most from housing prices going up were people that already owned homes and had them paid off. That they benefited the most. But let's talk about something that Wizard just mentioned, the cost of living crisis. The very worst thing that they could have done, that the central bankers could have done to try to fix a cost of living increase, and they used housing as an example time and time again, was increase interest rates at a very fast rate. Because everybody who's sitting on a 3% mortgage is going to hold that house and never sell it. You just restricted the supply of the housing market because I'm never going to get rid of my 3% mortgage if I have to replace it with a 7.5% or 8% mortgage. And you just did that. So right now, the housing market is still, it's not hot. The prices are high. There's a difference. The prices of houses is still high and they're not going down, but the market's not hot anymore. And that is the worst of both worlds for people who need a place to live.
yeah, and I just want to circle back to Arnie's point about how the obviously the developing world isn't cheaper than AI in some applications, but I mean if we're going to talk about minimum wage has been pushed up in many states in the US. And, for good reason, because it's almost impossible in some states to live off the federal minimum wage. And I know, like in the state I live in, you're seeing minimum wage up to 15. I think California has a pathway to 20 at some point. And the problem with that is not that people who work jobs that are considered entry positions or, you know, have a lower skill ceiling. It's that the these jobs are not as valuable as other jobs are to the rest of the world or the rest of the economy. And because of
Yeah.
that, they command a lower wage premium. So they have to also think about it that way too. And if we're allowing for somebody to come right out of high school, get $20 an hour, why should they go to college when $20 an hour would be somebody with a few years of experience and maybe a more technically oriented place? So you're talking about pushing wages up above minimum wage in the future significantly by doing that.
We could have a
I
whole
think
episode about the efficacy of college education, but
Well,
the minimum wage
yeah.
thing is very dangerous because it really screws the people in the middle. If you
And
are in the top 10%, minimum wage doesn't affect you very much because you're likely not eating at McDonald's every night, so you're likely not going to experience the effect as much of having to pay higher prices for a Big Mac. You're probably eating more more not I don't want to say high. Sorry, McDonald's, I love you as a stock. I'm not saying higher quality food, but you're probably eating food from a different income
well,
bracket.
I would say
You know what I'm trying to say, right?
when you
yeah,
go
So
to McDonald's, you get calorie dense food. You're trying to get something with as much calories as you can
McDonald's is
for as
lean
less
cuts of
money.
meat.
right,
It's
right,
with a
right.
bit
So
of salad and it's high fat, so it's going to be filling and it's
but if the
satiates you. But you're
lower end
talking,
of the yeah, if the lower end of the income scale suddenly starts making more money, then it's good for them. But it does really bad things for the middle class because now the middle class is paying more for everything that the lower income people produce. And the lower income people now have more money to push up demand of the things the middle income people would have bought used cars. Does it sound familiar when the used car prices went up? Well, it wasn't a coincidence that when people started making 15, 17, $20 an hour, that suddenly used car prices started going up at the same time that the middle class was not able to make the cars because the new cars to replace the used cars because of chip shortages. So we had a supply side push of people having hours cut in the middle class making cars, where at the same time the guy working the drive-through at McDonald's was suddenly like, I can now afford my first brand new car or my new to me, my first 1993 Cavalier.
Right.
And they're going out and spending more money than they would have for a car. So they're pushing demand, and at the same time, the middle class is getting squeezed on both ends. And that's very dangerous because if you take away the middle class's uh, drive, then you start to get into the lower class and upper class being at odds again, with nothing in the middle to buffer it.
Yeah.
There's a few, wait, before you jump in, Wiz, there's a few points I just want to cover off because we've just gone through like six different important. We went through.
No, we
we are
this is the
jumping
bonus
through.
episode. There
I
is no
know
rule.
there's bonus episode, but we're jumping through topics so fast. So I just want to just bring it back just a second and just like
That's
chop
because
those out.
somebody we
So
know won't pay for premium Zoom, and we only have 40 minutes to record.
that's
Well,
me. That's
I
me.
was going to circle back there. Yeah, I was going to circle back there, Ernie. Yeah,
I
because
mean, we
I feel
could.
like we did kind of speed run through a few things.
Yeah, so
But,
just bringing it back very quickly to the India, the AI, the robotics thing. I think in reality, it's going to be a mix of all three until because you won't see a throughput from robotics and AI by themselves for many years into the future. Emerging economies are still going to have their place, so that's just putting a little bow around that one. The income, like minimum wage and the I guess the class discussion that we're talking about is an interesting one, but it also has links and ties back to inflation because if you're seeing inflation in the economy and you're seeing your minimum wage go up by a huge jump, it's not just in the minimum wage, it's probably across all brackets. And when it's planned inflation, you want those income increases so everything stays at parity. It's when it's unplanned.
But
And
it
obviously,
didn't. It was so imbalanced.
but what I'm trying to say is that obviously you've seen inflation over the last couple of years raging, obviously unplanned, as evidenced by the fact that the Fed's target is 2 to 3% or 2%. I think with 2 to 3% for Australia, but for you guys, 2%. I think they say is their hard target, and that's why it's a bit of a correction, like an overcorrection, perhaps. The tricky thing is that when wages go up like that, especially in minimum wage jobs, it's hard to bring those back down because it's what the employee becomes used to. Is it a bad thing? I don't know if it necessarily is a bad thing. And Wiz, you were sort of making the point, like, why would anyone come out of high school want to go to college because they can get pretty good money straight off the bat? In this scenario, aside from the fact that costs are going up, you still have the highest ceiling when you get the college education or the university education. So that's sort of my thoughts, where my thoughts go on all of those topics.
Well, I would say that just to visit AI one a little bit more, it is deflationary for specifically for more white collar jobs because the applications of it right now that we have. So it's going to impact, probably journalism, writing, maybe even lawyers as well, in that way, which I don't think people are really thinking about that. Not that AI is totally competent and can totally do everyone's job, but it could streamline things for if you're just trying to generate a lot of content in terms of writing or producing documents, because it can do that pretty well. But to machines, replacing human labor is going to take a long time. I know that there's people out there excited about certain uh, companies making certain robots to do that. And I would just say be a bit speculative about that because um, having a human being versus a machine is not necessarily going to save you money. And the reason for that is those machines have to be maintained. Those machines do have to be have troubleshooting because they will break, they will fail, and there's a bit of a problem with factoring in maintenance costs when you don't have a history of maintenance on a specific type of product being introduced. You can always make, an extrapolation or interpolation depending on which way we're going, but I would just be err a little caution there um, about
Well, I mean,
being
we've
too
talked about the
excited.
AI thing too. About you have to tell me how it's going to reduce your costs or increase your revenues. And
Yeah, I don't.
I have
I
yet
think it's
to
just
have
going
a
to
lot of
save.
companies tell me
Oh,
that.
sorry. Sorry about that.
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Wait.
yeah,
King, please repeat what you said because it got lost,
yeah.
and then Wiz, you go.
But I was just saying, like I said, you have to, you as a company, that every company is now saying AI, right? But nobody has yet to tell me what they're going to do with the AI that's going to reduce their costs or increase their revenues or increase their profit margins. Like nobody's telling me exactly what they're like. There's companies everywhere saying AI. They have nothing to do, like laundromat services. And they're like, oh, we're using custom AI to clean your clothes better. How? Well, it cleans your clothes better. How is AI cleaning my clothes? Like you can't tell me how it's doing it. Is it using less water so that you don't have to pay as much? Is it well it's AI. It's cleaning the clothes better. It's like, okay, there's a lot of companies out there that just they're using the words, but they don't yet have a plan for how it's going to actually come to fruition. And that's a problem because we're still in that bubble territory. So AI is not a catch-all. It's not going to save the universe. It's not going to do a whole lot. And just wait until somebody comes up with, hey, all the stuff that we're using for AI and all the production that it goes into making the robotics and the AI infrastructure is actually hurting the environment. And then we start going down the whole, ESG thing, and then AI is now suddenly a bad guy. Wait till that happens.
Well,
True.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways this can go, but I think we can see clear pathways for AI right now is trying to generate large amounts of writing, especially maybe more technical writing. And that may be where AI really can land its hat now. Um, just from what I've seen, what I've heard, and I may be wrong, and that's okay. If someone can correct me, I'm more than happy to be corrected on it. I am not an AI expert, but that's just what I've seen and heard over the past year or so. And programming too. I think it's pretty good at doing code. So there's some good applications. Those are good, white collar jobs that can be impacted. Um, but how it ties back to wages, right? I feel like people aren't really understanding how bad inflation can get still if we're not if we're allowing for minimum wage to continue to go up like this. I don't want people to be poor, but I don't want us to be living in an environment where, housing is so restrictive that you need to live in government housing in order just to have a place to stay. And that's really what's kind of becoming the normal.
We
I
are seeing wages start to go down though, because like Walmart's new hires are actually coming in lower than they were before. So we are starting to see the minimum wage get clawed back a little bit. I shouldn't say the minimum wage, but the artificial increase in the minimum wage that we had seen.
Yeah, the effective wage, I think that's what it's called,
Yeah,
something like
effective. Yeah,
that.
effective wage.
But yeah, well, that was because businesses were hungry for work and now they don't really need it as much, which is good, right? There's a balance there. But there's been governments all throughout the United States in different states trying to promote higher wages anyways. Even within certain counties and cities, they've been tinkering with the minimum wage. And I feel like we're going to actually see, um, maybe for the first time, minimum wages being pushed down.
Well, we can take a little bit of an example from the auto industry, because in the 80s the auto industry went through the robotic revolution where robots were taking people's jobs, and they were making cars where people used to screw on a bolt on an assembly line. Now a robot was doing it. But one of the things that the auto industry had to come to grips with and figure out was you can lay a person off. You can't get a refund for the robot. So one of the problems is that you better be damn sure that you're going to need that robot to do that job for a very long time. And what they found out is that retooling factories and redoing robotics costs a lot of money. So sometimes it's actually more beneficial for us to have a person sitting there riveting that, because if we get slow, I can send them home. But I can't send that robot that I paid $1 billion for. I have to monetize that robot somehow.
Yeah. It's a good point. It's a lot of factors in that. My concern is always a hyperinflationary scenario because of how reckless Congress has become with spending money and making a budget. At least back in like the 70s and the 80s and the 20s and the 30s, they would occasionally, rein in spending and and try to actually pay down deficits and have a sound economic policy. And now I feel like it's just we have to keep spending money to spend money, otherwise we're going to have the economy shrink on us, and then where do we go from there? I just don't know what Congress's plan is anymore, except from getting from artificial budget crisis to budget crisis.
Well, it's a rosy picture we paint, and it's unprecedented. But I'm glad that we get to witness it. It'll be very interesting what occurs. So, hmm.
I just
Yeah,
remember
that's
the last time that we balanced the budget was right after Russia had just lost a war against a grueling, atrocious opponent, and their government collapsed. And China had decided that it was going to go ahead and be friendly to capitalist investment all at the same time. I mean, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does freaking rhyme.
Spot on,
I
man.
yeah, I think that if we get into a balanced budget perspective, which it's one way or the other, something's got to give. Um, then maybe there's hope that we can, bring some sense back to how money's going. But I just don't see it. I really just don't see um, the shift yet in the underpinnings of Congress to make that a reality because they can just keep printing as far as they know.
Well, we did say it was going to be a quickie. It's gone on a bit longer than anticipated, but Appreciate you boys. Appreciate the chat always. Should we wrap it up here? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot more to talk about, but I know we've got some time limits. So
Wiz, we could talk about this ad infinitum. I feel like there's always something to chat about, and I like that. It's a good
I
aspect.
mean, we could always go back to crapping on Tesla, so we could do that for like hours.
Me versus you two, just just
Just in
white knighting.
general.
I don't want to, I don't want to crap on Tesla just for the sake of it. I mean,
Let's
I'm kind of in the middle there.
we'll do a Tesla centric episode. That'll be interesting. You know who
No.
we should? Do you know who we should invite on? Is CEO of Booty, because I don't know if he'd want to chat with us on here, but he's hardcore, man, hardcore pro Tesla. Anyway, it's thank you very much for listening, tuning into the We Hate Money bonus episode number 2, and we'll be back next week. Thanks, King. Thank you, Wiz.
Thanks, Arnie.
See you, boys.